Hello! So today we are going to learn how to make a felt dice. This is what it's going to look like in the end. One important thing to note about it is even though it's made out of squishy wool, at the end it's going to be super firm so that it can roll like a normal dice. That's unlike, say, a doll, which will be a bit more squishy. See? Like I can squish this doll pretty easily, and the way to do this is basically going to be to poke it with a needle for many hours. Fortunately, you're not going to have to watch that entire process. But yeah, we'll get a start on it. Here is a clump of core wool that we're going to use. If you're not sure how big this is going to be at the end, because it is a little bit hard to gauge, what I'll try to do is I'll just try to squish it as much as it will squish. And basically it gives you a rough idea of like how small it's going to be once it's done. It's not an exact science certainly, but like you'll get a rough idea. And like obviously we're going to go for one that's kind of this size. I have a feeling that it's going to be smaller. To be honest, if like it turns out to be smaller, you can always course correct, right? Like you can always add more core wool. Technically speaking, you can take scissors and cut some off if like it turns out to be too big. So you can fix it either way if it's not the size you want it, but smaller is slightly easier. So anyways, we are gonna take a 38 gauge needle to start with. You don't have to. You can start with a larger, like a 36 gauge, or a smaller 40 gauge if you would like. But I'm just going to start with this at first just because like we're working with a big piece of wool, and the medium is for me a nice compromise one for when I'm getting started. It's important to kind of force the shape that you want onto the wool. And what I mean by that is you're going to hold it in the position that you want it to be, that you want it to form it. So if you were going to go for a circle, you would try to shape it as a circle and then like use the needle to enforce the shape that you want. Because we're going for a cube, I'm going to be trying to press it into a cube shape. And early on, it doesn't matter that much. You can also see that I am alternating what side I'm poking to keep things relatively even. At first, you don't really need to concern yourself too much with if the sides are even or not. I'm going to be eyeballing it to try to make sure that all the sides are roughly the same. But if you just keep alternating what side you're hitting, you're going to get that effect anyways at the end, more or less. And again, like you press it down on both sides to help condense it, so that when you hit it with the needle, it's doing what you want it to. By the way, if you don't know what core wool is, it's basically the inner wool that you use as stuffing. And it is something you can get in abundance. I can give a link in the description as to where I personally bought this core wool. How I'm determining when I'm going to switch from condensing this with a 38 gauge and swap to 40 gauge is actually pretty simple. Once I am poking this and the resistance gets to be to a point where it's annoying to poke it, I am going to switch to the 40 gauge because I'll be able to poke it a lot easier at 40. It is becoming a cube. You can tell that the sides aren't flat. I'm not too worried about that at this very early stage. Obviously, as I go on, I will try to make the sides as flat as possible because like that'll just help it roll, I assume. I am putting a bit of an emphasis on doing the edges because the edges will otherwise poke out, but at this early stage it's not that big of a deal anyways because we're gonna be more worried about flattening it out and making it more cube shaped towards the end. I just want it to be maintaining roughly the shape of a cube right now. And if you're ever not sure when it's ready, like if you don't know when you're done, to a certain extent you're done when you say you're done. Like you can always poke this more, but at a certain point you'll get diminishing returns. It'll stop being smaller it'll stop being firmer. What you can always do is you can squeeze it, and you can kind of determine based on your squeezing how much give it's giving. Like if you look at this one that's already done, when I squeeze it and I apply a decent amount of force to it, it has almost no give to it, which is what we're going for. We want this, even though it's made out of wool, to be really tough. Like if I toss this on the ground, you know, it's not gonna give any bend or anything. It's just gonna kind of flop around. It's gonna roll like a dice. If you're wondering, I'm getting close to switching needles at this point because as I poke it, I can feel the resistance. So yeah, we will come back after this is closer to a dice. Hey, so we are pretty close to being ready to move to the next phase at this point. You can see here that they're roughly the same size. This one that I've been working on is a little bit bigger, but it's going to condense a little bit more. If you can see when I press down on it, you might not be able to tell, but there's still a bit of give here. So I can condense this a little bit more. I could declare this as being done as is, but I want to be a bit more thorough with it. One other thing to note at this stage is you probably can't tell that well just by looking at mine, but if you ran your finger over it, you'd be able to tell that this is still fairly bumpy. And in addition to that, the edges here are a little bit more pushed out versus the inner part. So when I am working on it now, first off, I'm pressing on the sides rather hard at this point, and I'm focusing more on the outer layer of it to try to even everything out. And the reason why I'm pressing so hard on it is to try to make sure that it stays in the cube. It stays in a cube shape as it can possibly be. Also, you may note that I am not using any kind of finger protection. You probably should. I probably should. The reason why I don't is because I find that it affects my ability to properly grip the wool if I'm using a finger guard. The downside of me doing things like this is I stab myself with the needle fairly often. Like way more than most people would want to. I personally don't mind too much if I happen to stab myself with the needle. That doesn't really bother me. However, it's not advisable, and honestly, you should probably be smarter than me and just use a finger guard. So I am going to be doing this for a little while longer. I'm going to both be trying to push down whatever bumps there are, and also give that focus towards the edges. And of course, I'm still switching sides. Okay, having done much more stabbing, I think this is pretty much ready for the next phase. There's very little give left. I've smoothed out the sides as best I can, at least at this stage. So now comes the part where we actually make the dice into a dice. And the way we're going to do that is going to depend on what theme you want for the dice. You don't necessarily need a theme, but I rather like having a theme for the dice. So I decided for this dice, it is going to be Final Fantasy XIV themed, because I kind of want to do that Final Fantasy XIV logo on it. And what I'm thinking is the Final Fantasy XIV logo is going to be the 1. Then for the other numbers, we are going to use blue, green, and red to illustrate DPS, healers, and tanks. And also the other reason why I wanted to make a Final Fantasy XIV dice is because I wanted to see what it would end up looking like if I used black as the base color of the dice. The idea is that I'm going to have white be the color of the Final Fantasy XIV symbol. And can I actually do the Final Fantasy XIV symbol? We're gonna find out, I guess. The main thing here is just to keep everything relatively even in terms of coloring. It's gonna be super easy to do because we're using black, so it's gonna be really easy to tell if somewhere's missing color. As you can see, there's lots of places that don't have color so far, that doesn't matter. This was just like a little bit of color to start with. I put in color in small sections, and that's maybe not efficient, but I do like doing that, mostly just so that I don't end up with a large excess of colored wool in any one area. As you push in the colored wool into the core wool, you're going to see some of the core wool start sticking out. That's okay, you just put in more colored wool and you keep doing that until you have the same color everywhere on your dice. So I'm going to work on this for a little bit, and we will get back once I am done. Okay, so I have pretty much got the black everywhere. So now I am going to attempt the hard part. And that is what I'm going to do for the one side. As you can see with this dice, I made a bunny. This dice is themed after a friend of mine, Yuikai, so that's why the bunny is there. Given that this dice is themed after Final Fantasy XIV, I am going to attempt to put the Final Fantasy XIV logo on here. Will I be able to do that? I have no idea. What I'm going to be using for the logo is some stringy white wool. Here's how I'm gonna try to do this. What I'm thinking is that I can probably form an outer circle here. So let's see how this goes. You might be asking yourself, why would I be attempting a logo if I don't know that I can do it? And the reason is that I'm only going to get better through practice and through attempting stuff that I might not be able to succeed at. So even if this turns out to be a disaster, it'll be a win to some extent because I will have gained experience and I will have challenged myself, and by challenging myself I will hopefully get better over time. I am trying to make this a circle, and you can see that I am using my finger to try and encourage it to be a circle because the end of your finger is somewhat curved. So by using that as a guideline, I can make it curved. And I'm also trying to make the circle in the center, roughly, to give myself, well, both because it'll look best if it's roughly centered, but also because that'll give me the most possible space to make my sun flare. You don't need to worry too much about making a mistake, even though it is true that I am pressing this wool into here, which would make it harder to pull out afterwards. I don't necessarily need to pull it out if I don't like it at the end. I could just put on more black wool over top of it to cover it up and then try again. Alright, so I got like half of it done. Let's try to get the other half going. Need to press into it fairly hard, and then I go at it from the side. I also want to twirl the stringy wool together because I want it to be relatively thin when I press it in. You can always thicken it later, but it's harder to thin it later. Yeah. Alright. It's also hard to kind of be precise when your finger's in the way, but my finger has to be in the way because otherwise it won't hold still. Okay. Alright, this is doable. Okay, there we go. There we go. There we go. We're making progress. Making progress. I'm making a circle. And if I succeed in making this logo, then the rest of this dice is going to be pretty easy. I'll show you how to do the rest of the dice, but the rest of it is not going to be nearly as tough as this part is going to be. I got the outer circle now. It's not completely center, I don't think, but I'm willing to live with some degree of it not being center. I'm attacking this with my needle from the sides to push the outer layer away so that I have a better circle in the middle. You can see that you can actually use the needle pressed against the surface to push some of the wool where you want it if it's not going where you want it. Also, I see that there's a little bit of white here and here. That's not white from this wool, that's just a little bit of core wool exposed. So I'm just going to take a little bit more of the dark wool and I'm going to put it over there. I can always do this also to hide any of the other wools if they ever appear in a place I don't want them. You will notice that the core wool will stick out the most along the edges, so that's the place you're going to have to work on the most when it comes to applying more of your colored wool. Okay, let's try to do the flares. I don't have confidence that I could emulate these flares exactly as they appear in the game, but I'm gonna do my best. Let's see. This is too much. This is too much white. You can see that I am rolling it together to make it a little bit easier to work with. Then what I do is I press it in at the starting point. I push it to where I want it to be next. I press it in at the middle, say, and then I can push it again to where I want it to end up. And if it doesn't end up exactly where I want it, I always have the option to add more. One thing to keep in mind is that even if something doesn't look right away, you can still stick with it and see how it turns out, because sometimes things don't look right in the early stages, but they end up working out after like some tweaking, so you don't necessarily need to abandon a thing right away. It can sometimes get better. I say that in part for myself because I'm not 100% confident about how this looks so far. I'm actually kind of liking this as I go on. Alright, you know what? At this stage, I think I want to thicken the circle, because those are like the main flares for this. Next, I want to kind of have the circle have like some jagged edges, but before I do that, I'm going to thicken it some, which is a little stressful because I worry about ruining my circle in the process. Alright, I've lost the circle a little bit. Let's see if I can't round this out a bit by attacking it with the side of the needle. So attack it at an angle. You can tell when I attack it at an angle, I am not just pushing down the wool, I'm pushing the wool away. And that helps me give it a shape. Do I like this? I want more. I want more going on this side, I think. Alright, I think this is where I'm ready to declare victory. It's not perfect, obviously, but it turned out better than I feared. I'm just going to apply a little bit more black to try to cover up any like little excess strands of white that may have cropped up. I did a little bit of cleanup work, just reapplying some black. If I could offer one thing that I wish I had done better, I'd say that the circle is a little off-center. In particular, there's a lot of like unused space over here, and in part that's just because there's more flares on the top, which is true of the actual Final Fantasy XIV logo circle as well. Maybe I could have like had this start lower though in anticipation of that. I'm not sure what the best route would have been, but yeah, there's not as much space used over here, so that's unfortunate. At any rate, we're going to move on from that, at least for now. We are going to put on the numbers. Now, the rule for numbers when it comes to dice is opposite sides always equal 7. So you can see that this bunny is the one side. So on the opposite side is the 6. So I'm going to use this dice that I've already made as a guide, and I am going to follow the same rules. So we flip this over, we flip this over. We are going with red circles for the 6th side because we want the red circles to symbolize the DPS. And we'll see how this red looks on the black. Also, just as a heads up how I'm going to be making the circles, I literally just roll this into a circle, I press it down, and I push it in. And actually the red, I think, looks pretty good on the black. So yeah, it is not that difficult to make a circle, as you can see. You do want to be conscious of your space, that you're leaving yourself enough space for all 6, and you obviously want each circle to be as close to even as you can. You can adjust as you go, but obviously the closer it is, the better. And I think this one's a little too big. So let's get this a little smaller. Okay, so you can see that I got the 6 now. It's not perfect. The circles aren't quite the same size and the spacing isn't exact. So these are things that I can improve on with time. But let's move on to the 2 for now. We'll mimic this one. And you can see that I personally use bigger circles for the smaller numbers. So for the 2, I am going to use blue because tanks are blue and there's only going to be 2 tanks for the dice. One thing about these circles is I try to push them in as much as possible so that they are flat against the surface, or at least as close to flat against the surface as I can make it. Remember, these have to add up to 7. So if this is 2 on this side, then on the flip side, this has to be 5. And you can see that it is indeed true here. We will do the 5. Alright, 5 is done. Let us move on to the 4. Alright, 4 done. We just have one side left. So now we just got to do the 3, and the 3 is going to be green to designate the healers. Alright, I think we have a dice. Now, I am probably going to take some time to clean it up some more, but yeah, that's basically how you make this. And you can make essentially any kind of dice you want with it, with this strategy. So, I wish you luck, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Alright, thank you and bye!